Well, papers on moral selfhood, conception of knowledge, and sacred space ensure that we have entered the dark night of this day not gently but vigorously. The floor is open for questions. Please come forward and discuss with our excellent speakers.
My name is Keith Thompson. I'm a United Methodist pastor from Denver, Colorado, and I have a question for Klas. I think since we're at the University of Chicago, it would be remiss if we didn't have a question related to Gülen's theory of knowledge and epistemology that didn't have some relationship to the philosopher here at the University of Chicago, Paul Ricoeur, and his theory of knowledge and its relationship to ethics and how it might relate to the Gülen movement and Islam in a broader sense. He had a very, he always tried to protect the boundary between philosophy and theology. A lot of people would say that his philosophy is a resource for all kinds of theology, Christian, Jewish, and Islam. I wonder if you would agree with that in terms of an understanding of philosophy. Does Gülen's philosophy of knowledge, is it fair to put it in a category of being modern versus postmodern, one way or the other? And also, I would just say that Paul Ricoeur's Gifford Lectures, a very famous book entitled Oneself as Another, in which he challenged the long Western tradition of the autonomous individual as being the most important metaphysical reality. His notion of oneself as another really is something that could open up to a Sufi Muslim understanding of mysticism, our connection to each other and God. So that's a lot of different things, but if you're aware of Paul Ricoeur, how would you relate that to what you said about Gülen's epistemology?
Well, thank you. I don't feel totally confident talking about Paul Ricoeur, even though I read some of his work, but it's a massive oeuvre and rather complicated at times. But in my reading, or as I've been taught Ricoeur, there is very little of the theological side from how we teach philosophy in my university. I think this opening of the ipse idem and the different ways of being I, there are of course similarities. What I find most interesting in Ricoeur is his, in this, and that could lead also to the second question, that this knowledge by correlation, it was a Ilma Husuli, that he's acknowledging that, but he makes a difference that just because you have to narrate knowledge, it doesn't mean that any narration is as true. There is the witness and there is something that is the experiencing person which makes a difference. And I think that's a similarity you can find, that you can't, there is a difference if there is a true experience or if it's just a make-up story, even though both has to be stories and will be affected by how the story is told, how much reflection goes into the story. And I would say in terms of modern, postmodern, this understanding of the knowledge as only correlation and therefore contingent is of course compatible with a lot of postmodern epistemology, but mustn't therefore be postmodern. I think it's, I mean, Gülen is truly traditional, and in such he can be both modern and like transcend modernity by going beyond those. And I don't find that distinction very useful in understanding. It's he's truly traditional. Fundamentalists are more modern in a way. That's right. So, and maybe true traditionalism is postmodern. I don't know.
There we go. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for three very different perspectives, yet in one sense, for me, they came to a point where I'm wondering if you guys could speak to what Gülen said about knowledge of the other and what we've been discussing, because I think what word I'm not hearing is that word of community. You mentioned, Margaret, the communal interconnectedness, you mentioned sacred space, and that's where we as individuals come together. And I'm curious if you can speak to what Gülen's comments were and writings were on knowing the other, the Ubuntu of knowing oneself by knowing the other, if we can speak to that. Thanks.
Professor Rausch or Professor Pahl, do you want to go first?
Sure, thank you very much. I think that's implicit in all of the different levels of sacred space that I talked about. Obviously, God is other than we are, so prayer would lead us to an encounter with some very great difference. But all the way along, so in the third category of the sacred space of civic society, through the practices of music and art, poetry, literature, even in sports. Gülen says there's a capacity to learn to recognize one another, not through conflating differences, but through the dignity of differences, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks puts it. And clearly that's the case with perhaps the greatest other, and yet also that which is closest to us, namely nature itself, of which we are, as Klas pointed out, we're embedded in nature. Try doing without it for a day, and yet we also experience it as other. And so the temptation is to abstract ourselves and abstract transcendence or the sacred from the contingencies of the natural world. And it seems to me that's a problematic and difficult move that Gülen very subtly and carefully, because of the danger of shirk, is making or recommending.
I think I would second something that was said earlier today. You know, you have this problematic of Gülen's thought of being humble and not focusing on yourself and not considering yourself to be special, and you know, him denying his own recognition as being important to the movement. So you have this this aspect, but at the same time, as I said, in self-refashioning, I mean, you're focusing on your own development, and there are different aspects, different layers that I didn't talk about, and one of them is, you know, self-reflection and self-critique and so forth and so on. So a certain amount of your energy does have to be focused on your own self, although, you know, your main focus is serving others. So there is this, on a practical level, yeah, you're helping others, but you're growing through your own service to others. I mean, that's one of the parts of the last theme in the paper, is that your own growth is dependent on your practice of Hizmet, and so that's, I don't know if that helps.
The question is really on knowing and learning and understanding others, because there is a distinction between serving others and then getting to know them, and that's the knowledge question. I'm wondering if this Gülen speak to that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, but I don't.
So,
Go ahead.
I think it's important that this paper I've had here is focused exclusively on this Emerald Hills of the Heart, which is key concept in the practice of Sufism. So it's directed to this self-improvement or self-learning or finding commonality. So in that sense, it's not about any concrete knowledge about the other. What it is, of course, understanding that we are all the same and we go up in the big unity. And through the stations, we realize that more and more, that we have the same prerogatives and so on. and predicaments. But I think what I wanted to point out, that even though this is the constraint of this study, you might say, for his part, there is still these connections to action, that it's not enough to know yourself and be confident, as it can be in some Western-style Sufism, I would say, that there is, even in this work, even though it's not on that subject, there's always the connection to action and being together with others and serving others, but not, there's nothing on how we know the other like that, no.
I'll follow up a little more as well. I haven't made a concordant study of this, but I would be willing to wager that one of Gülen's favorite verses from the Quran is the one, I can't cite surah and verse for you, but it reads, and I'm paraphrasing, "I have made you different tribes and nations so that you may know each other." Now again, my translation may be off, but somebody who knows Arabic can help me out on that. But he quotes it all the time. And I think the way it gets instantiated or put into practice in the movement, two dramatic ways, would be through an event like this one, where we come from very different places, very different traditions, very different commitments, and yet we're learning together to recognize that difference and learn from one another how to live in peace. So the practice of interreligious dialogue and its central importance for him. But then secondly, education. And we'll hear more about this tomorrow in the paper on the schools in Nigeria, but I had the opportunity to visit two of the schools in Uganda and several of the schools in Uganda and Kenya, and was stunned to learn that 75% of the students at this school in Kampala are Christian. And here you have young men learning together, across the range of the curriculum from very different tribes and traditions, studying together, living together every day, and learning to live together in peace. And one last anecdote to sort of wrap this up. Last weekend, some of you know, was the American Academy of Religion meeting in Atlanta, Georgia, the professional guild of scholars of religion. And there was a session there on the upcoming election in Nigeria, taking place in 2011, and there's great concern. One of the speakers was the former U.S. ambassador to Nigeria, who, let's just say, was not very proud of the kind of things he had to say. Jacob Olapuna, on the other hand, was there from Harvard, who spoke about possibility of the indigenous traditions building bridges, and the fact that every Muslim is also a practitioner of some indigenous practices. The same is true of Christians, and so we need to think about the multiple identities of people. A young man came up afterwards and spoke and said just some eloquent things, and Nigerian, and I asked him, just out of curiosity, so are you familiar with Hizmet? And he said to me, "Oh, yeah, the Turks, sure, they're great. Lots of my friends, they tell me, they're with me, they're studying with me at Harvard." He's working on his Ph.D. at Harvard. He says, they tell me if it wasn't for the Turks, I'd be in Al-Shabaab. I'll leave it there, by way of knowing the other and the possibilities and the ways the movement builds that into place.
Mahan Mirza from the University of Notre Dame. My question also is for Jon Pahl, or it comes out of his talk. Anybody can answer it. You're listening to the different circles, from the individual to the family to the schools and education, civil society, intercommunal, and then nature.
Right.
I was wondering what space is left for the secular. And if I could maybe direct it a little bit further, either an omission or something that I thought was missing, especially from the definition of civil society, is politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all know that sometimes power, politics, greed, policies, they can work against preservation of nature or respect of nature, let alone the individual.
Yep.
or communities. And so does Hoja Effendi venture here, and what does he have to offer?
Thank you. That's a really great and complicated question that I appreciate very much. It's something I puzzle over in my own work. And well, in addition to, this is blatant commercial, but, we're in the social business after all, right? So my book on sacred space would be one place to start thinking that through. But then my most recent book, Empire of Sacrifice, The Religious Origins of American Violence, rethinks what we mean by religion in order to take into account these hybrid flows of authority as they operate. So what space is left for the secular is the question as you put it. It changes according to each culture and dynamic, doesn't it? And there is no one absolute rule, I think, that can be offered for it. It's always going to be a fluid negotiation. I like very much Robert Wuthnow, a sociologist who talks about different spheres, but it's really less about spheres or sectors as it is about modes. And here again, my mentor Marty has been really good at getting us to think in more fluid terms about how discourses, practices, communities, and institutions interact and relate through language and ritual and those various practices. So Bob Wuthnow, I think gives us some ways to map the different flows between the sacred and the secular and how they intermingle and overlap and relate. But it's fair to say that I'm not a fan of any absolute dichotomy or dualism between them. The other thinker I would recommend is Hannah Arendt, who I think very helpfully distinguishes between force, which is the domain of the secular as I would see it, right? Military. Unfortunately, it gets so often sanctified, doesn't it? But the distinction between force, power as the ability of people to act in concert, and then authority, which is something altogether different yet, and really emerges from that trust that is forged in a living relationship between people that emerges from the ground up. And that, it seems to me, is where the sacred is most present and manifest, is in that building of authority, and the secular is the domain of force, if you will. But these are ideal types, and again, there's no one rule that can apply to every culture. It's different in Turkey, it's different in the US, it's different in France, it's different in Germany, it's different in Congo, and it's different in Nigeria and Kenya and all the rest, but negotiating it out. Others, yeah.
Did I understand correctly that force is the domain of the secular?
Well,
I don't want to lock you into absolute categories.
Don't do that.
Okay. No.
Because I can't defend it, first of all. But in the book, I have a definition of religion which sees religion as the condensations and compressions of experience. And finally, it's a functionalist definition that says religions exist to end violence. Mm. That's why we have them as human beings.
Right.
And the secular exists to protect us from those people who don't live according to the deep religious principles of the global traditions, the global ethic around the globe.
Right.
But no, I'm not. I can't possibly defend that.
I don't mean to challenge that or push for a specific answer. The only question that comes to mind is then, having heard panels on the inspiration that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam,
peace be upon him,
provided, and the central role that he plays. Force had a role to play in his career, and what I'm looking for is some sort of engagement or reconciliation with that tradition, with that aspect of the tradition in Hoja Effendi.
Yeah, well, he discusses jihad very clearly, and he says, there's the primary jihad, which is the struggle within oneself, and then the second jihad, and it's pretty clear when the secondary jihad is legit, and that's when it's authorized by a state that has the authority to do so, and when it's defensive, right? It's not too complicated, actually.
I wonder if it might be worth offering a different kind of angle on this just real quickly, which is to hearken back to the stipulation of moral space and ask ourselves the question if the stipulation of moral space is axiomatically religious, or instead rather location where value is articulated, and religion is one of the ways it's articulated. So that, in other words, it seems to me another way to read Gülen is as someone who is involved in a two-step operation, which is what I took to be implied in Professor Pahl's presentation, which is to say that there are spaces in which kinds of meaning and moral claims are articulated. Those spaces are complexly secular and religious.
That's it.
And then there are different kinds of value claims that are made in them. Some of those can be religious claims, but they don't have to be. And then we're in the realm of dialogue and discussion, and that harkens back to the encounter with the other.
Yeah.
That might be another way to think about it that would make these categories a little more plastic.
Thank you.
I think one aspect I would like to add is the Turkish context, that speaking about politics from a religious perspective has been very awkward in the Turkish perspective. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why there's this constant saying that this is not the political thing. Of course, I would interpret this model that it's how you act within politics. You have a Hizmet attitude. So there is no separations. But of course, you're in the secular setting, but you are acting in accordance to this model.
Good.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yes, sir.
I just have one thought that can be put forward very briefly that relates to this. Having some domain of sacred space, most like in a metaphorical sense, it may also be good for religious people. One of the ideas that emerged out of a study of the Fethullah Rashad, the famous Islamist journal in Turkey, was an argument formulated. Well, the journal quit publishing for the last time in the middle 60s, so it was obviously before that date. So already in that period of publication, the argument was put forward, probably by the editor, that secularism was a style of government in a country where most of the people were Muslims. Talking about Turkey, of course, and trying to cite, and of course, at that period, religious people in Turkey were playing with a weak hand, trying to defend their own space and make this point. And it's certainly one worth considering even still, I think.
Short comment regarding the concept of moral community. It seems to me that there is a rich tradition regarding what is moral community that often is being used as kind of social society, environment, in that sense becomes moral. My question for Klas, in your analysis you came up with the concept of theory of knowledge. My perspective, of course, is very much into sociology of knowledge. You also mentioned Tariq Ramazan, and I'm adding to that few others who talk about change within the religion, and particularly here, reforming Islam and so on. In your reading, is that distinction clear that is made by these people between religion, the principles, the pillars, the tradition, and the knowledge of religion? So if there is going to be change, are we talking about the change of knowledge of religion? If that is the case, then are you also see the same readings in Gülen's work?
Thank you. I think that's this difference that I didn't go into between Ramadan and Gülen, that I would say that Tariq Ramadan is much more prone to talk about a change of the actual religious base as well. And if I have to leaf through it a bit. So I would say that Gülen's argument is that there should be a deeper knowledge, as people have been saying. He's not a reformist. He doesn't claim to be thinking new. He is going to the tradition and putting forward the tradition. And in relation to science and religion, there is a definite, we'll say that religion has the first place, that science should act within the realm of religion. And now I need to find the right words here, because it's a bit technical. But what Ramadan wants to do, especially in his latest book, this Radical Reform, is to say that you need to put the scholars of context on the same pairing as the scholars of text. So he says that in the Usul al-Fiqh, you need to have this true reformation, that the context should be as important and must affect also the scholars of texts and how the text is laid out. So it's really the book of the universe and the book of Revelation has exact same status, which I would say for Gülen is not the case, that there is always Revelation has an upper hand and science should bow or be within the limits of traditional religious knowledge that needs to be revived but not reformed.
And where there might be an affinity, if I might add, between, shocking that I've between Tariq Ramadan's epistemology, his reformist epistemology, and Gülen's epistemology, kind of as interpreted through the lens of Professor Pahl's idea of the spheres of sacred space, particularly that last sphere. Ramadan is saying that the sphere of knowledge is so much larger now that in the medieval period you could have ulama who basically mastered not only the usul al-fiqh and usul al-din and that, but also mastered what we would consider now as secular knowledge, knowledge of physics, knowledge of other elements of the natural world. But now that knowledge base is so large that you really need to expand this notion of who the ulama actually are. So there is, I think, an overlap and affinity between Gülen's epistemology in that regard and Tariq Ramadan's epistemology. Well, if you'd please join me in thanking Professor Rosengarten and this wonderful panel.